So where we got to last time we spoke is an area that I think there's potentially going to be quite a lot to explore. And that's just after you'd sort of quit DJing in 83, 84. I'm really interested to find out more about your journey into the obsession with the Beatles, kind of how that came about and what that journey looked like.
Well, I think what really happened was that when I stopped DJing, it freed me up musically to just listen to what I wanted to, because prior to that, I mean, not to say that I didn't, there wasn't stuff that I just listened to, but I didn't get very much time to do that. So constantly I'm listening to the new dance releases, getting familiar with those and everything. So when I stopped, it kind of created a vacuum whereby all of a sudden, musically, I just opened right up. And with the Beatles, obviously growing up in Merseyside, especially, I mean, it doesn't matter where you were, anywhere in the Western world, they were all around you. That music was part of the soundtrack of your youth. It was just there. And the records that came into the house, as I mentioned to you, were mainly soul records on Tamla Motown, Atlantic Stax. So there weren't Beatles records in there. I think I remember having the Magical Mystery Tour EP, the double single.
Yeah.
But I can't remember. Might have been one or two more scattered about, but there wasn't loads of Beatles records about. And I remember hearing Sgt. Pepper's, throughout my youth in people's houses. And so it was already a kind of favourite album, but I'd never really kind of absorbed it, sat down with it properly, taken it all in. And so that was almost the start, I got a copy of Sgt. Pepper's. I got a book by Philip Norman called Shout, which was, a biography of the Beatles, quite a famous one. And it just, within weeks, I had everything that ever recorded. I was just went album for album, and I was finding books and it became obsessive. It became, I really wanted to understand it fully, because I thought that I had a chance of properly understanding it because I was from Merseyside, so I understood the environment from which they came and everything.
Yeah.
And, what was happening with the music and stuff. One of the real benefits of the whole thing about the Beatles story is that it leads backwards and forwards in terms of, if you know about what happened during the times of the Beatles, you're already transporting back into the 50s and even the 40s, because they were born, during the 40s and the war years and everything. So your history is starting to block into place. I always felt it should be taught in schools, and this is one of the reasons, because it's a colourful period in history, what was happening in the 60s. And I think it's something that, when I was studying history in school, I remember they were giving us the Industrial Revolution, and, it was all very grey. And whereas, and this is what it did for me, because, it opens up all avenues, politics, of course, drugs and psychedelia, the avant-garde. I mean, the Beatles, fingerprints everywhere. I mean, that was the thing about it, with, where the obsession kind of really took hold, was you didn't realize, it's like you don't realize, you knew it was massive, you knew it was the biggest thing, they were the biggest group, but you didn't realize how big it was. You had no conception. It just keeps getting bigger and deeper and bigger and deeper. And this still goes on today, when we get, something like the Get Back films were amazing, but we never thought we had that. That was the Let It Be video at one point, which was seen as, looking at the Beatles splitting up. It was bleak, and all of a sudden we get this beautiful thing comes out of it and everything. So it's the gift that will always keep giving, because it was a phenomenal thing in so many senses, and it kind of touched into so many areas. So, if you just close down to the music, how it influenced everything that was going around it at the time, how it influenced what was happening within the music industry, how they, like Sergeant Pepper's Sleeve, it had the lyrics on, it was a gatefold. These were all new ideas, and it was the Beatles that were bringing this through all the time. Even like way after the Beatles had split, the CD market didn't really take off in the 80s until they got the Beatles back catalogue. Once they could announce that, bingo, everybody wanted to buy a CD player and stuff. So, their influence lives on and reverberates out, so, and that's without even going into the music. And that's where the proof's in the pudding, it's all about, the music they created and the quantity of quality, what they were doing.
It must have been quite interesting for you then, in the sort of respect that the Beatles initially were so sort of influenced by black music coming from America. That must have been quite a point of interest.
Well, all this was done in kind of reverse. I put this together after the event, so to speak. So once I started to learn about the Beatles, I could put it all together. I understood enough about rock and roll to now really kind of understand where they were taking their influences from and how all that happened. Because, one of the big things, I did some research at one point, and I was reading a book, a guy called Spencer Lee, who's a very famous kind of Beatleologist, and he had a conversation with Bob Wooler when he was alive, who was the DJ at the Cavern, and they basically listed all the tracks that the Mersey beat bands were playing at the height of that period, and the majority of tracks were by black American artists. It was quite, in fact, it wasn't what they were playing, it was what they'd recorded. Or they went through all the bands and what they'd done. So that kind of influx of black American music really kind of hit Liverpool. And what you've also got to take into account with the Beatles' early doors is that the British pop industry at the time was all about bands like Cliff Richard and the Shadows. The Beatles, probably from a London perspective, when they were kind of trying to get the deals and stuff, they would have probably been seen as a little bit behind the times. They were still drawing from rock and roll and rhythm and blues. That's where they weren't at that particular moment what the music industry thought the next big thing were going to be. They looked out on the deal. It was George Martin who picked them up for Parlophone. Parlophone was a small subsidiary of EMI that put out things like comedy albums, The Goons and things like that, and like a bagpipe player, they might have an album. They worked in small numbers almost. That they they kind of made small profits, but they put a lot of specialist type stuff out, and that's what George Martin had been doing. And he wanted to sign a pop band, and it was the Beatles walked into that, and it was a beautiful, happy accident, because they've been turned down by so many labels at that point.
Was it interesting for you? I mean, I'm guessing, and I may be way sort of wrong here, with the conversations on the Record Mirror podcast, that you would have been checking so hard for singles when you were DJing, probably more so than albums. Was it nice to be able to kind of really took into something that is so much about the album format?
Well, I mean, I was kind of always into albums as well. I'd buy albums and stuff, and I'd play album tracks. Sometimes you couldn't get the track you wanted to play on a 12-inch. I think this was just more about a musical freedom, you know, a proper musical freedom. Because towards the end of my DJing, there was tracks that I kind of wanted to play on that scene, but I'd taken so much criticism for Planet Rock, for Buffalo Gals, for playing these electronic records or records by people associated with punk or whatever on a black music scene, even though the black kids absolutely adored these tracks. So there were certain tracks along the way that I was a bit reluctant on. I've never played Situation by Yazoo, the Francois Kevorkian dub, which I loved, and I really I'm sorry about that, but I knew that I would have got criticism for playing a white British pop band. That's how it would have been perceived by certain people. So there was that. I mean, towards the end, one band that I was hugely into, like just as I was finishing DJing and everything and moving into my next kind of period, was Yellow, the Swiss electronic band. I was massively into them, into You Gotta Say Yes to Another Excess, all the remixes from that, the album Stella, which followed that up. So, you know, I was listening to bands like Yellow that I wasn't playing in the club, although there was a mix of Pumping Velvet that was you know, just kind of worked in. It didn't have too much of the Yellow madness in it, you know, the vocal madness in it. So I was open to explore. That's what had happened. I now had the time to explore music on a different kind of level. I didn't have to think about it in terms of the dance floor. It was just purely for my own personal pleasure, you know, and that was great. And so, you know, the thing with, as I say, when you come across something like the Beatles, it puts everything else into place. You know, I was able to start to properly put the 60s together. And even with that one album, Sgt. Pepper's, you can almost pin it right down to that moment, and then everything will come out in a radius backwards and forwards from that. You know, that's a perfect kind of moment when the whole thing reached its zenith. You know, it was they'd gone beyond being a pop band. This was they'd gone into high art, you know. But without being pretentious, with just being four lads from Liverpool. It was like Derek Taylor, their press agent. You know, they were just four Scousers looking for the meaning of life. You know, and they found more Scousness. That's what he said. You know.
I do think I'm quite lucky. My daughter started getting into the Beatles, so we've been able to listen in the car, because I got really into them in the mid-90s when the anthology came out. It came out sort of at the right time, so I recorded that and would just watch it. But recently, just sitting in the car with my daughter listening to it, it's really made me think, what would they have been without George Martin? Because his orchestration does so much of the kind of what makes the tracks great, particularly in that sort of mid to late era.
It's all the people around them, you know, down to like even Mal Evans, who you saw in the documentary, who was with them right through that whole kind of time, from driving the car around to the early gigs and stuff like that. You know, Neil Aspinall, who was again a driver who ended up running Apple. He run the whole shaboodle, you know, in the end. You know, people like Derek Taylor. I mean, he's one of my absolute favourite Beatles characters. He's from not far from where I was born, and so he was a local reporter, and he became the press agent and did all the early stuff. But what I loved about Derek Taylor was that he went over when they broke the States and everything. He went over there, but he ended up staying in the States, and he worked with the Byrds and the Mamas and the Papas, and he helped arrange the Monterey Pop Festival. He was a huge kind of player, and then eventually he came back to the UK and he took the role at Apple. And there's a fantastic book. One of my favourite Beatles books is a book called The Longest Cocktail Party by a guy called Richard DiLello. He was the house hippie at Apple, and he worked in Derek Taylor's office. And the book really centres around Derek Taylor more than anybody else. apparently Liam Gallagher's got the copyright on it. I read this years ago, and he was considering making a film of it. But it's all about the Apple era, you know, and the kind of madness that surrounded that. So it was like they were fortunate with a lot of people around them. They attracted these people to them, you know, and it was like George Martin. He didn't sign them on the music. He was a little bit kind of nonplussed with the demos that they brought in. There's a mad set of demos where I think they were kind of trying to spread their net wide. It was like almost a variety set in certain ways. But he said it was the charm that did it for them, the personal charm. You know, it's like they just met, you know, the famous quip of George Harrison. It was that on the first studio session, George Martin turned around and said, "You must tell me if there's anything you don't like." And George Harrison said, "I don't like your tie." You know, which is brilliant. You know, the guy would have either hated them and got rid of them, but fortunately George Martin was the man he was, and he loved them. And where he connected them was through the Goons. You know, Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers, they did albums. They were like pre-Monty Python. They were like, and so Lennon, you know, and the other Beatles were really into the Goons. So George Martin put out albums by the Goons. That made him kind of cool in their eyes, you know. And so these connections all came together, you know, and it was the perfect storm.
I suppose that leans in maybe to the style of the films that the Beatles did then as well.
I mean, the first film is the kind of pop movie classic, Hard Day's Night. Yeah. It's just beautiful, you know. Richard Lester, amazing job. Richard Lester did the second film, Help, which didn't hang together as well. It's got its moments, got some amazing numbers in, you know, like, you know, Ticket to Ride and stuff, and when they're skiing, and there's just some fantastic. I'm so glad it exists for all that, but it's not, you know, it's not in the kind of realm of A Hard Day's Night. And obviously later, Magical Mystery Tour, which was
it's something else, isn't it?
Died. Paul was pushing that. It's just a series of sketches, really. It's just kind of flung together. It's a curio. I mean, they put it on I think it was New Year's Day or Boxing Day of '67. But I think it was Boxing Day '67. They put it on BBC primetime, but it was a colour thing, and hardly anybody had colour TV, so it was in black and white. And it was like seen as the first moment where the Beatles properly started getting criticism and being seen as being indulgent. So up until that moment, they couldn't do wrong. And at that point, that's where there was a little bit of a kind of turn against them.
I suppose
didn't like the fact they grown the hair long and they were taking this LSD stuff. That didn't go down too well.
Yeah, because would Rubber Soul have been after they stopped touring? Because it goes Rubber Soul, Pepper's Mystery
Rubber
Tour,
Soul, they were still touring.
Right.
When Rubber Soul was done, and even Revolver, I think there's some tracks. That I remember from a Japanese concert. You know, they're doing Nowhere Man and stuff like that. Which I'm not sure they got as far as of Revolver, but it all stopped in '66, and in it, you know, it was wild how it all stopped. You know, the last tour it was where John had said the famous "bigger than Jesus" quote, and the Bible Belt of America, and the Ku Klux Klan, and everyone just went apeshit about it. And you know, they seriously were in danger. You know, and then they went out to the other thing about that tour. I mean, they've been in Japan and they played the Budokan, which was like seen as a sacred sports place. And there was a lot of protest from the old schoolers in Japan against them doing the Budokan. But the worst thing was the Philippines, because they went to the Philippines and the Marcoses were in control. And the Beatles never did civic events. They never got involved in that. So Brian Epstein gave a blanket, no, we don't do that. And they've been invited to this civic events for the Marcoses and everything, and they didn't know about all this. I mean, Brian Epstein had handled it, and I think what happened was they woke up in the hotel in the morning, and something felt really strange, and they couldn't quite work it out. And then they did, and it was all security had gone. They'd been left to their own devices, and they basically turned on the TV and saw all these kids round a table kind of crying because the Beatles hadn't turned up for this civic event, and the nation was against them. And they literally got to the airport, and they were getting kind of kicked and hit as they got in. People were hitting them. They got on the plane, you know, like what? And then the police came on. And they told Mal Evans he thought that they were going to take him off, and that he was going to be stuck there and everything. It was really hairy. And I think after that, George Harrison was like, never again, no more, no more. It was just too big and too dangerous. And by that point, obviously we're now getting to the psychedelic era. The drugs are coming into place. Things are getting a little bit more twisted. There's a brilliant book called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which it's about Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, who were basically the people who set up the whole psychedelic thing on the West Coast. They did these events in Ken Kesey's barn, which the Grateful Dead. That's where they start off and everything. And the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, it talks about the Merry Pranksters going to see a Beatles play at a gig at the Cow Palace in San Francisco in 1965. And they do this, I mean, they're all tripping and everything. They're all serious acid heads. And they do this almost ritual and welcome the Beatles. They want to bring the Beatles into their domain. And they even put these kind of signs up and did this whole thing around it. Beatles never even knew that this had happened. So Beatles would have come in a van with no windows, got out, done the gig, got in the van, been off and on. But the pranksters came in, went into the gig, all tripping. And what they witnessed and experienced, and this kind of overpowering force with these fans and everything that was directed at these four guys, freaked them out. And they had to get the hell out of Dodge, so they left the gig, and they went back. And the Beatles obviously never came because they didn't even know they were there. But that very night, a guy called Owsley, who was the most famous LSD manufacturer in America, turned up out of the blue at their camp. So they didn't manifest the Beatles, but they got Owsley, and they got the acid for the years to come for themselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you hear that come into the sort of Beatles music and stuff. 'Cause I think for me, Rubber Soul is kind of the most cohesive band album, I would say. Because for me, and it's maybe not popular opinion, the subsequent albums are all collections of really good songs, but I don't think necessarily flow that well, sort of start to finish, as like a single piece of art.
Oh, well, I mean, I personally, I think that the album that followed that, Revolver, a lot of people would pick that as their favourite Beatles album of all time. I kind of put Rubber Soul and Revolver together. They feel like a pair. So, and Peppers obviously is what it is, this huge concept. I mean, I love Abbey Road as well. I love the medley. What I love so much about Abbey Road is that they made what became Let It Be, which that was released after Abbey Road, but they recorded all that stuff before they did. So they'd had the whole time where the Beatles were ending, and they'd filmed the film Let It Be, and all the press was saying it's all over. They've lost the spark, and so they didn't put the material out that they'd recorded around Let It Be. And it's almost like they managed to rally themselves one more time and pull themselves to a chord, and then go in and do this, with just such incredible stuff on, like Me Come Together, Something, She Ain't Heavy, I Want You. I mean, these are serious kind of, and the whole medley side, which again was like a whole new thing. So for me, it's like Beatles is obviously subjective. People are some people are like the really early stuff, the Mop Top era, they won't really like the psychedelic side of the Beatles as much, you know. Some people like the mid-period, like what you're talking about with Rubber Soul. But there's something there for everyone. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
And so when you hear people say, I don't like the Beatles, it's almost like, well, yeah, but what side of the Beatles don't you like? It's so multi-encompassing. If you can say, I don't like any of that, I would seriously doubt whether you could like any music in general. You know, what's there not to like? I think people obviously get pissed off from time to time with the fact the Beatles. You know, I get that, and I think there's times where you have to move away from the Beatles. One of the most interesting things for me was what happened in Liverpool in the late 70s, and the Club Eric's, the famous club where all the bands like Echo and the Bunnymen, Teardrop Explodes, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, War, all these kind of different bands, big in Japan, they all came out of that scene. And the kingpin behind the scene was a guy called Roger Eagle, who was a DJ going back into the 60s, who worked at the Twisted Wheel, which became the famous Northern Soul Club. But he was there before the Northern Soul had been coined, that term had been coined. He ended up coming to Liverpool via, I mean, he was promoting gigs at this place called the Stadium. It was like a boxing stadium. He'd had Bowie on there and Led Zeppelin and all sorts of people. And then he opened this kind of punk type venue, Eric's, with his partners. And it just became a massive hub for Liverpool. But what he'd say to the bands, all these bands, like, and he was much older than them. He's a huge, big, imposing character. He says, don't listen to them. You haven't listened to them, have you? And they knew what he meant. And what he was saying to those kids was, you've got to let go of those shackles. If you'll be in the shadow of it forevermore, you've got to let it go, dismiss it, and do your own thing. Break it down, start again, which I thought was absolutely fantastic advice, because Liverpool was so much in the shadow of the Beatles, and following the Mersey beat era, you know, so from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, there was very little happening. You know, you didn't have the band scene on that level. You know, I mean, probably the only band of note during the earlier 70s was a band called Deaf School, but they're only seen as an influential band for what came later. And I think that part of the problem was obviously because they were in the shadow of the Beatles, and you can't, you know, you can't compete with that. You know, they did it, and people have just got to try and find their own different ways of making their statements and coming through. You know, because there is, if you're a Liverpool band, and certainly back then, you were immediately compared with the Beatles, and it's a terrible comparison to have, because you can't win.
Yeah, it was interesting watching Get Back, because this is something where I was interested in sort of finding out more of your perspective on it. Because watching that, it's mad seeing them going in and just kind of going in sort of 9 to 5, drinking cups of tea, writing music, trying to borrow equipment because they can't get anything from the label and stuff. So it's pretty mad marrying that with what I perceive their level of fame to be. Because I suppose it's before the 80s and the capitalism that made superstars what they became.
I mean, it was just remarkable how they managed to remain grounded for so long, being in that bubble. And for as famous as they were in the UK, you could multiply that in America. People don't understand how big they were in America. You know, it was just that's why it all kicked off when some of the controversial things were said, and people couldn't. I mean, that got John Lennon killed in the end. The guy who assassinated Lennon, basically, it all stems back to those quotes, which was to a friend, Maureen Cleave, who worked for the Evening Standard. He was just talking about, isn't it crazy people put more in store in the Beatles than they do in Christianity? That's how he was putting it across, but in his hack-handed way, it was this bigger than Christ quote that came out. And And, that eventually found him all those years later, tragically. The guy who did it was absolutely aware of all that. He was a total Lennon obsessive, to the nth. So,
yeah. And one last thing to ask you then is, did you get the Let It Be documentary? Did you manage to get hold of that in the 80s when you were in this serious sort of research period?
Yeah, I got to a few kind of fairs, and I was getting stuff like the Shea Stadium concert, the very first concert they did in America in Washington, which is absolutely nuts. It's just crazy because it's a circular venue, and it's the amplification that they've got is minimal. It's just like. And they're literally moving their equipment around so that they can face a slightly different way. It's incredible. But the gig is just fantastic. And, there's a fantastic documentary about the first time in New York as well. Absolutely brilliant, That was the thing about them. Even, it's like now we're in a kind of the internet age. Everything's recorded. The Beatles sit at the very start of that because it's incredible how much it was recorded with them, even though we didn't have the computer technology and everything. There's books that will tell you what was happening in their lives day by day. I mean, it was like once people had seen it, whatever it was, that caught them on that level. I mean, people put it down to the fact that in the States that Kennedy was assassinated in the November of 83, and the Beatles arrive in the February of 63 and 64, and so it was in the backstream of that, and it was enabling America to smile again because they came into the country and all these hard-bitten journalists were throwing these questions at them, and they were just bouncing back with these really witty comments and making these hacks laugh. They were laughing with them. And then, when they went on to the Ed Sullivan Show, it was the biggest TV event of all time in the States at the time. No one had bigger viewing figures. It just and yet the first singles, and we're talking about the R&B connection and everything, the first singles, so Please Please Me, From Me to You, She Loves You, I think those three, there was one other as well, that they weren't released by Capitol Records, which EMI was the EMI kind of sister label in the States. They declined them, and they were released on labels like VJ and Swan. Like VJ is like this big R&B label. So they were originally released on R&B labels in America, and then Murray the K, the DJ that really took to them in New York, and in the old footage you can hear him on the radio talking about the Beatles, and he was called the fifth Beatle from a New York perspective. He was massive R&B fan. I mean, there's beautiful footage in that documentary where he's on the radio and they're in the hotel room and they've got cameras in both, and they're just basically requesting tracks on his show, and it's all kind of what would have then been probably seen as quite obscure rhythm and blues acts, like that they were asking, like the Exciters and stuff like that, and it's incredible. They're not asking for their own music to be played. They want to hear this stuff, and the thing about the Beatles as well is that they always talked about the music when they said who the track was when they were covering it. They come back from America with, you'd see them with like piles of records, and they were all kind of soul music albums and stuff, and so they absolutely kind of supported black music. I mean, Rubber Soul in a sense is kind of saying this is what we aspire to, soul, but we can't do it properly. Plastic soul, rubber soul. It's not the proper soul. It's our version of what we can do. So they were like, massively influenced by black music and massively respectful of black music and black music artists, as were the black music artists of them, which must be said. That they thought the Beatles were incredible, which they were. Yeah.
So how hard was it to get this? Like, it sounds like your sort of Beatles digging was pretty intense, sort of hard to find stuff. How were you getting all this?
Bookshops, fairs here and there. There was a Beatles, there's a Beatles fanzine type thing that you could kind of get. You know, I mean, I was doing this as well through a time when I had no money. I was kind of picking up things, but that's why I was going like all around books, and I find something, you know, I find bits here and there like cheap, and it's like that Longest Cocktail Party. I found that in a secondhand place in London. You know, it was just I just walked in, and there it was, you know, and so I was kind of acquiring things in that way. And then, you know, obviously if there was something new coming out that I had to have, I'd be buying that. And I mean, in the end, it got to such a point where I just thought, I've got to stop buying. I'll only now buy the really special ones that come along, you know. Then it was everything. I had to have it all. I had to kind of, you know, see it from so many different angles. The story's told from a lot of different angles, you know. And then there's Lennon's story that follows that as well, which takes it into other realms and stuff. So it would take more than a lifetime, you know. It's just there's just so much been written, you know, that you could never really properly keep up with it in a sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of my friends was telling me that there's a new book that's coming out. Someone's doing a load of books, and they've done one about, I think it's up to the point where their first single comes out, and it's like 800 pages.
Yeah. Talking
about their different lives, and then there's an extended version that's like 1200 or something. You can just go so deep on it. It's absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, definitely. And they'll probably still get called out on what they've missed, you know, with like the fanatics. They'll probably say, well, yeah, that's not in there, or you should have done that, you know. So it's a thankless task as well, you know.
Yeah. Was it quite nice then when Get Back came out? Because, I mean, I've not watched Let It Be, but from what I understand, it paints quite a disharmonious picture, if that's a word. Whereas, you know, you watch Get Back and you can kind of understand a bit of where they were and that they were getting on for the large part of it and stuff. Yeah. Was it nice getting that closure?
Oh, I think so. I think it was really special because, you know, Let It Be was, I think that was their only opportunity to sell it, really, because they didn't really have the film that, you know, they wanted. I mean, the Beatles had an obligation for a certain amount of films, but initially, when they did that, they probably thought it was another Hard Day's Night or something, you know. But this was a film. It was a kind of cinema film, Let It Be. And, you know, it kind of fulfilled that obligation and stuff. But really, it didn't have... It wasn't what the film company would have been looking for, as you know. So I think that it became this basically almost like a funeral procession of the Beatles, you know. And when the album came out later, which obviously came out posthumously in terms of they'd broken up at that point, that kind of endorsed that. So Let It Be seemed quite somber, really. It seemed a whole. So the Get Back thing, I mean, it was originally going to be called Get Back, the album, obviously the lead track, but they called it Let It Be in the end. So the Get Back kind of Peter Jackson, you know, it was wonderful. You know, it was so close in there. How they did it is remarkable, you know, to restore
Didn't they have,
everything
like,
to that.
Bugged plant pots and things like that?
Apparently they did. They had everywhere bugged, you know, and so they got all the conversations and everything. So, as people would, I suppose, if they were going to record the Beatles and have this fly on the wall thing with them, they'd want to get as much as they could. And so it just turned into this really amazing thing, you know, and even more so when they moved back to Apple and Billy Preston comes into play, and that's just beautiful, you know, because he gives them an energy, you know, at that point. He pulls it back in and they're cooking again and it's all kind of working. I mean, Lennon was a heroin addict through that period and stuff, you know. He was struggling, you know. It was a hard time. Paul just obviously wanted to keep it all going and trying to, you know, do his best. I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, the part in it with when you see Paul picking Get Back out of the ether, and he starts to put it together, and it's just wonderful, wow, like just the way they work. And that's it with something like that, it didn't surprise me. None of it surprised me, because from what I understood about them, it felt like that would have been the way they were with each other. But it gave us such a close in on it. We were so close in on that whole situation and their creative process and everything. And so it was such a gift, like after all these years, that we can be gifted something like this. We think we've seen it all. We've Beatles, we've seen it all, we've heard it all, we've read it all, and then something else will come along and it'll just blow it wide open again.
Yeah, I think my favourite bit in it is just when Ringo comes in one morning and he's like, yeah, I've been like playing with this thing, Octopus's Garden,